guys, and welcome back to Dark Matter Podcast. I'm Dominique.
And I'm Avalon. Alright, so today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be diving deeper into society and culture, and we're going to be looking at Indigenous peoples and the effects that colonization had on their cultures. And we did want to mention briefly that there's obviously many other Indigenous cultures that we're not going to be talking about today because there's just too many to get into. But if you find this episode interesting, we definitely encourage you to do more research. If you're listening in a different country, maybe you can do research on, the Indigenous people from your country.
Right. But before we get into today's topic, we just wanted to recommend a podcast to you guys. And if you like our true crime cases, then this is definitely for you. So this is Student Verdict Podcast, and they cover true crime cases all the way from the UK. So here is their trailer for you guys.
Hi everyone, it's Emily from the Students Verdict Podcast. We're a new, bi-weekly podcast covering true crime cases, some you might not have heard of. So far, we've covered cases such as the Monster of Worcester and the disappearance of Marlene Oakes. The Students Verdict is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play and Spreaker. Also, find us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube and Facebook. And remember to keep living the dream.
So yeah, if that sounds like something that you're interested in, then go give Emily a listen. But without further ado, let's get into today's topic.
Right. So first we're going to get into who are Indigenous people. So there are more than 370 million Indigenous people spread across 70 countries all over the world. There are those of the Americas, like the Native Americans in the US, as well as the Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders of Australia. And we really wanted to dive into what their life was like before colonization, because it was very different before, all of expansion and stuff like that. So first we're going to get into a few different regions of Indigenous people, and the different places that they inhabited. So first we're going to talk about the different regions that Indigenous people inhabited, and we're going to start off with California because that's where we live. So there are over 100 Native American groups that live in California, and those that live by the sea were able to live off of fishing and native plant life and stuff like that, while those that lived on the inland, like the Pomo, hunted small game, and they also gathered acorns and pounded them into mush to eat. So now moving on to the Southwest, and the natives of the Southwest were divided into two groups. So they were known as the hunter-gatherers and the farmers, and the Pueblos were the best known of the natives of this area. And if you're from California, you might have studied this, because I do briefly remember learning about this in elementary school, but like I said, it's very brief. It obviously doesn't cover the extent of what all there is. So the Pueblos were best known for being the natives of the area, and they were skilled farmers, and they grew many crops. They also used irrigation canals to bring water for their farming. And now moving on to the plains. So this is the area from around Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and this area holds large herds of buffalo and antelope, which provides a lot of food for them. And the Native Americans of the plains included the Sioux.
I know, it sounds so weird. I only know because I've heard it said.
The Pawnee, the Crow, Cheyenne, and the Comanche,
I think, or Comanche.
We're
probably gonna mispronounce.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Things in this episode because we're not familiar with these. But
right, but we are obviously trying to do our best.
Yeah.
So, there's also the Great Basins, and this includes all of Nevada and Utah, as well as most of western Colorado. And this is home to the Shoshone, the Powhatan, and the Utes Indians. And it's super dry and hot over there, and most of them that live in there were called diggers, since they're forced to dig for most of their food.
Right, so there's and obviously this is just in America, so you can see the variety of different tribes and what they ate, what they live like just in America. So there's so many across the world, and it's just interesting for me to kind of think back to that time and what it was like. I thought that was really interesting with the diggers, that they had to get their food from the ground, because you don't even think of that, you know what I mean, having to dig for your food, that sucks. That must be so difficult. And it's just interesting to think what life was like for them. But yeah, I think that a lot of them too lived in harmony, and they just kind of they ate their food, they caught food, they just kind of lived. I feel like it was more peaceful, or definitely more peaceful before colonizers came in.
For sure. And there's definitely more harmonious, and I feel like, and like a very different way of life than it is right now. Definitely more like slow paced, and they're more like community oriented, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly. And next we kind of wanted to go into like indigenous religion and their connectedness to nature, and like kind of just some of the cool things they believed in. So this is from pantheism.net. I just want to say, like, I'm not a pantheist, but I think it's super interesting, and like I don't know, like, because it's pantheist.net, so I was trying to think, like, is this like a credible source? But it's kind of just like about the religion, and so they were talking about Native Americans because they held some like pantheist beliefs. So I just thought it was really, really interesting. So this is a quote from the website. So they said animals were respected as equal in rights to humans. Of course, they were hunted, but only for food, and the hunters first asked permission of the animal's spirit. Among the hunter-gatherers, the land was owned in common. There was no concept of private property in land, and the idea that it could be bought and sold was repugnant. Many Indians had an appreciation of nature's beauty as intense as any romantic poet. Religious beliefs varied between the tribes, but there was a widespread belief in a great spirit who created the earth and who pervaded everything. So I just think that's so beautiful that, like, they didn't have, like, what's the word? Boundaries. What is it called?
Like borders, yeah. Like boundary lines.
That word, yeah. They didn't, like, have borders, you know, they just like lived without it, because people often say that it's like it's literally an imaginary line, like it doesn't actually
it really
exist.
Is, yeah,
it doesn't, like, in reality we just make it exist, like we make it doesn't really exist,
right?
So I think that's so cool that they just, like, of course there was like fighting, there was still, like, it wasn't perfect harmony, but just I feel like their whole mindset was different, and they lived in relative harmony because there wasn't like mine versus yours. It was like, because of their belief in like the great spirit, like a lot of them that believed in that, I feel like it was more like everything belongs to like the spirit, or to, you know what I mean, like everybody was just equal, and there was like less division, a lot less division than we see
absolutely.
Today. And then going on to what they believed on the white colonizers, so this is another quote from that website. So they said the Indians viewed the white man's attitude to nature as the polar opposite of the Indian. The white men seemed hell-bent on destroying not just the Indians, but the whole natural order, felling forests, clearing land, killing animals for sport. So I thought that was also really interesting, because I myself am vegan. I just like really care about animals, and I feel like nowadays it's like people are just much more conscious about, you know, just like being kind to animals and being kind to nature in general. And that's so true that it's such an, like, it's kind of just like an archaic idea to me, the idea of killing animals for sport, you know, just for fun.
Right.
So that must be so interesting, because that's so like ingrained in our culture to go fishing, or like some people, I think hunting is like less common, but
maybe in the South, like, it's more
like
common,
in certain
for sure.
places for sure it's pretty common. So I think that's so interesting to take a step back, and like when, like, you know, the colonizers got here, or the settlers got here, the Native Americans were like, what the hell, you know what I mean? Like, hunting was not a thing, because like they said, they obviously like had to eat animals at some point, because
for food,
depending on where they lived, maybe there weren't enough plants, you know, and they had to eat something, but they only ate what they needed, or they only killed what they needed to eat.
Right, like it wasn't for like sport or any like recreational activities. It was purely for like necessities.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like it's just a very different way of viewing things, and I feel like we could learn so much from them, that because like that's so true, that they're like, oh, he's like, the white men are like hell-bent on not just destroying us, but on nature, you know, and that kind of is
very
true, that we've destroyed nature. I mean, like, we have national forests literally just to preserve that nature, just to be like, please don't tear this down,
right, know? Like this section of land is like off limits,
because we've basically torn everything else down. So I just thought that was really interesting, and really like relevant today.
Yeah, and we'll get into this later too, but we do also get more into the whole land issue between Indigenous people and the government, because that is definitely a problem both before and now more than ever. So
when the settlers came here, and today, like actually today, so it's remained an issue. Absolutely.
And then obviously, you know, with new population coming in here, there is the effect of colonialism on Indigenous cultures. And of course they had a huge impact because of who they came into contact with, you know, whether that was like Europeans, mostly Europeans, you know, but that of course led to a lot of other problems, like conflicts over territory, ultimately their land was taken from them and the US gave them crumbs. And it's very interesting because I feel like even now, like, that is such a point of contention between the government and indigenous people. And I understand it because like we mentioned, like, these people literally came here from another land and just suddenly claimed it as their own, and they're like, this is our land now, we're taking it and this is all you get.
Literally, yeah, like you, we'll give you this, you can have this. And
even
Native
though it was
Americans
already
probably,
theirs.
Yeah, they're like, and the thing is too, I feel like Native Americans in that day they didn't even feel like ownership over it. It was just like they lived at, because I feel like they if they viewed animals as equals, they probably viewed the like nature and at large and like just everyone as just kind of a circle of life. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
I feel like they didn't feel like it belonged to them. I feel like it was kind of just like
home.
Yeah, like a resource for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that just the idea that like not only are these colonizers coming in and taking it and like making it their own, but then they're like, oh, here's what you can have, and it's like, dude, this wasn't supposed to be owned. Yeah. It was just like, you're just supposed to live here. And like, even the fact that we call them, or like we don't call them Indians, I was reading the quote off earlier, but I think people more and more are not calling them Indians, but like even the fact that they've been called Indians for so long, it just goes to show like how
like they didn't call themselves that, like we labeled them that.
We're not in India, like it's not even like, it's crazy to even like, I feel like even calling them Native Americans, we'll talk about this later, but I don't even know if Native American is the right term, because like they were here before it was America. Like if I was Native American, I probably wouldn't even want to be called that, because I'm like, I'm not American at all, like I'm just from this place, you know what I mean?
That's another thing. It's like giving them labels that they themselves don't use, you know, like how appropriate is it for us to do that to them? Right. And then one of the things that I feel like is a huge loss is obviously their lost cultures and languages, because obviously before people settled here, they had their own way of life, their way of society, their cultural practices, not to mention like languages and religion and stuff like that. So of course, that has been lost along the way because of, either forgotten practices, but also because their history was practically erased along with anyone like who could live to tell it. Like we mentioned, like because of all these people coming in, there was a lot of devastation to indigenous populations, and that was either due to disease or fighting for, again, over territory and stuff like that. Right. And there was also the belief that the native people were, savages and uncivilized, because I guess it was strange to the people who hadn't seen them before, but in reality, it was the settlers who ended up bringing disease from over Europe, and they killed many indigenous people.
Yeah, I think that people saw them as like dirty and like savages because they literally just like lived out like in nature, like they're camping basically all the time, like that was their lifestyle. But yeah, like they literally brought disease over from Europe, so it's funny for them to be like, oh, they're savages, they can't take care of themselves. And it's like, dude, they've been here for thousands and thousands of years,
like they were doing just fine before you came here.
Yeah, like you brought the disease over here, you were the dirty ones, the nasty ones. Like people just like, I feel like everybody thinks their own culture is like right, and it's like the only way of viewing the world, especially back then when the internet wasn't a thing, and when like even sending a letter was difficult. Yeah. So
like took 2 months.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was extremely hard to I mean, it's just really weird when you saw a new culture, probably, because it was like, what the hell? People do things differently than we do.
Right, yeah.
Because like obviously in this era, like we kind of have an idea of other cultures from
right, like we're more exposed to it.
Yeah, exactly. But that was definitely not a thing back then. Not to condone anything, but I just it's just interesting that I feel like they were so entrenched in their beliefs that they couldn't imagine, anybody could be different than them and be doing things right.
Right,
you know what I mean? And so next we kind of want to talk about the oppression that's continued, as I mentioned earlier, into today.
Right.
And one thing, kind of like going back to what we were saying about not seeing other cultures as valid, is the demonizing of their beliefs and practices. So like, for example, I took a class, it was an anthropology class, about, I don't remember the exact name, but we talked a lot about shamanism, because the professor did her PhD work in Peru, and they have like a big shaman scene. Shamans are having a moment
cool.
there.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of like, it's like a ancient thing, like they still have shamans, and she would go and like see them and like it's super, super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that she mentioned was, this wasn't about Peru, I think it was indigenous tribes in Mexico, or what's now Mexico.
Right.
And she said that they would use peyote as medicine. So if you don't know what peyote is, it's like a small cactus. It's like a little round cactus, and it has like hallucinatory, is that
hallucinogenic?
Yeah, hallucinogenic.
Yeah.
It has those kind of effects. So basically, like what we would think of as like LSD or shrooms or something like that. But it's obviously all natural. It's just
right.
It's a cactus, and they would like have this like ritual where like everyone would kind of like take it together. And it's viewed as medicine. And she mentioned this about Peru as well, that they take ayahuasca, or you can take ayahuasca there. I guess you could take it here too, but it's illegal. Right. But they have ayahuasca available, and it's also like a shaman thing, like more of a tribal thing. Like it's a really ancient,
like ritual type of thing.
Yeah. And it's seen as medicine. Like they literally see it like that's what it is to them, is medicine. But for us, especially because of the war on drugs, that was the war on drugs, like the tough on drugs things, like the
which is really just
era.
Which is really just a crackdown on colored people.
Yeah, literally, it's just like people when they say like hard on or tough on drugs or whatever, tough on crime, it's like tough on people of color.
Exactly,
even if they didn't commit a crime. Yeah. But because of that, like that sentiment that like drugs are bad, and even what drugs are,
right?
We see that a lot of Americans might see like peyote as as a drug, and there's been like issues with in Peru and in different countries with the things that they use for like rituals that, or maybe not even rituals, just like a part of their culture, becoming demonized and ultimately like criminalized, like actually being outlawed. And it's just crazy because it's like, just because we view medicine one way doesn't mean it's right. And also like our medical system is so fucked in America that like we have no place to be telling other people that like their medicine is wrong or whatever, just because it makes you see things that we're not used to. Like we just kind of, I think people like equate all drugs, like they're like, oh, LSD and meth and peyote and weed, and like they're all the same, and it's like they're just literally not. Like it depends on what you use it for. And some drugs, like the natural ones like mushrooms and peyote and weed, marijuana, can be used as medicine,
right? And
they knew that back then. The Native Americans knew that, and many indigenous tribes like were aware of that, and so they used it that way, and it was good for them. And then settlers came in and were like, no, that's wrong.
Right. So, and I mean, I feel like that's part of the whole like whitewashing of their history too, and erasing of their history, because again, like we always get our history from the viewpoint of obviously like who won or who's in charge. Yeah. So if they are the ones who aren't telling the story, then obviously it's going to be a very different story from what actually happened, or from what they feel happened. Like everyone has a different viewpoint. So again, like that whole war on drugs thing too is part of that. Like despite the fact that it is such a huge part of their culture, they're suddenly like, oh no, this is all bad.
Yeah, like to go off of that, I remember my same professor, she mentioned in class that like in Peru they use coca leaves, yeah, for like everything. They use it as like literally you get there and they give you coca leaf tea. Like it's everything. People keep it in their mouth all the time because if you don't know, like certain places in Peru are like really high elevation and you'll get sick just being there. So if you use coca leaves, it actually helps. So you just like chew on it and it makes it so that you don't get sick. And they drink tea, and people like carry it around with them. Like it's like incredibly important to their culture. And I believe it was America. Was it America? I don't know. I don't remember who it was. I guess there's I think there's some kind of like international like drug situation where they can like make a drug like
classify it.
Class 1,
okay, yeah.
So basically they made coca leaves a class 1 drug, or class like the highest classification of drug.
Oh my God.
because so coca leaves can be made into cocaine. That's what cocaine is.
Okay.
But it's like highly condensed, like highly concentrated coca leaves. And if you take the actual leaf, like kids chew it all day and they're fine. Like it does not hurt you. And yeah, so that was like a big issue, that they literally made it a class 1 drug or whatever it is. Like they put it at the same level as like meth.
Right.
And it's a leaf. Like it doesn't do that to you, Like it's not. It's like, really just like criminalizing their culture.
Right. Like, I mean, I understand the whole cocaine thing. Obviously, that's dangerous. Yeah. But you obviously have to go through a process to get it to be that highly, like, what is it, like concentrated. But I don't think you should classify the actual leaf as that. If obviously people have used it and you see there's no effect, then that obviously isn't the same thing. And I feel like that you can definitely see the difference there.
Yeah, it's literally like saying like when cotton, like when it's on the plant, it's like saying a little piece of cotton is the same thing as like a shoe that it was used to make it. You know what I mean? Like those are different things. That's
very
how it is.
different.
Like the coca leaves is here, and then cocaine's all the way over here. So yeah, that's just like a little tangent, but I feel like that just goes to show that like universally, I feel like indigenous and like traditional like ancient cultures are always like just criminalized. Like the the new colonizers, the new culture comes in and they're just like, no, you're wrong.
Right.
It's
yeah.
like, but why? Like, why can't you just be accepting?
Yeah, and we've seen that like so many times over like the course of history,
especially in America. And we're actually going to talk about that now, the discrimination in America even up to this year in 2020. So earlier this year, if you didn't hear, there was an issue with basically the Trump administration wanting to take away indigenous land. So this is a quote from The Guardian. The Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, which traces its ancestry to the Native Americans that shared a fall harvest meal with the Pilgrims in 1621. So Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving, those guys, yeah, was notified late on Friday, this was in March, by the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs that it will be rescinding its reservation designation and removing the land from federal trust, according to Cedric Cromwell, the tribe's chairman.
So basically they're just saying, this is ours now, get off?
Yeah, and so the reason that was given is that the Trump administration said that they weren't Indians. They said by the classification of Indians, like they don't fall into it. And again, I don't like using that word because they're literally not Indians, because when I say Indians, I think of like Indians,
right,
people who
right.
are actually from India.
Right.
But that's the language I was used here. So basically, yeah, like Trump administration said that you're not actually Native Americans, and just as a side, not even a side note, just as like proof, they've inhabited this land for 12,000 years.
Does it even matter if they're Indians? That's their land. Like, you can't just go ahead and take it from them.
Because I think it's just like if they say they're not Indian, then they can get the land. You know what I mean? So it's like, I don't think they really even believe that. I don't think they really even care if they're Native Americans or not.
Oh, they don't.
They just want to take the land for them. Yeah. Because you know how, like, with casinos on Native land, and so that's been an issue because Trump has casinos, and he's like, I think that was why this happened, was because he wanted to build a casino, or because their casinos were competing with his nearby casinos.
Yeah. It's always over money of some sort.
It's literally, it always comes back to money. But basically what ended up happening was that a federal judge ruled in favor of the tribe.
Thank God.
And they were trying to maintain control of the 321 acres of reservation land, so they were able to maintain control. And the federal judge said the Trump administration's declaration that the tribe does not qualify as Indian under the Federal Indian Reservation Act was arbitrary, capricious, an abuse of discretion, and contrary to law. So basically they're like, you're making shit up, it's literally not even true what you're saying, and it's just not going to stand in court. And this is a side note, but I feel like there's been so many things that the Trump administration they've done that's been like so egregious like that, like just so mean, like villainous, like literally they sound like
there's literally no reason other than he wants to.
It sounds like a super villain. And then like the judge comes in and is like, what the hell were you thinking?
Right,
like, that's not going to happen. That's the side note. But thankfully, they did get to keep their land, but it shouldn't have even come up like that. Like, imagine, like, not only are they being threatened with losing the land, but they're also being told you're not an Indian.
Right, yeah.
By white people. I'm like,
how are you going to tell them what they are? Like, are you kidding me?
I would be so pissed. But, yeah, moral of the story, I'm happy they were able to keep their land.
Right, but of course, like, this is only one example of that situation. Yes. Unfortunately, land disputes like this happen pretty often.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I mean, if they won like that all the time, America wouldn't exist.
Exactly,
so they've lost majority of the time because this was, all of America was native before, so they've lost, like, even the small, tiny, tiny little places they do have, they're trying to take away from them, which is so disgusting.
Right. All right, so now we're going to get into the conditions on the native reservations, because just because they also have, like, sometimes they're able to keep their own land doesn't mean that it's the best quality. Some of the reservations, like, the quality is just absolutely deplorable. Yes. And just listen to these numbers. So the U.S. suicide rate increased 33% since 1999, but for Native American women and men, it's increased 139 and 71% respectively, according to the CDC. So obviously there's a huge spike in, you know, the Indigenous population, and we obviously need to figure out, like, why that's happening, because they make up so little of the population, and yet they make up so much of the suicide rate. The suicide rate. Yeah. And it was also found in 2017 that 54.3% of Native Americans used alcohol, significantly higher than other ethnic groups. And during the same study, 22.4% of Native Americans had reported binge drinking in the past month, which is almost a quarter. On top of that, 3 in 10 Native American young adults aged 18 to 25 report binge drinking, which is defined as consuming 5 or more drinks in 2 hours.
Yeah, so we did want to mention the stats on suicide and especially on alcoholism, not to be like, oh, look at them, they're alcoholics, but because I think a lot of times people like to blame others for their own issues, and that's not what we're trying to do at all. We're trying to bring attention to how bad it is on the reservations, because I don't think if that many people are suffering from alcoholism, if that many people are suicidal, and
then it's not like a personal thing.
It's not an individual thing. It's not just like, oh, they're lazy or whatever. I don't even know what the stereotype would be, but like, it's not them. It's like there's a bigger issue. Like, living on the reservations is not safe, obviously. Like, it's really, really negatively affecting them. So yeah, I just want to mention, like, we're not mentioning that to be like, because there's like this stereotype that they're alcoholics, but it's like there's a reason why this is an issue, and it's not because they're just like alcoholics. It's like they're struggling, they're suffering, and so I wish people would see it that way, that like they're suffering from alcoholism. They're not just alcoholics, like they're not just bums, like they're suffering, and like we need to do something to help them.
Yeah, and I feel like people do see that as a stereotype, like they have this high number in suicide and drinking because that's just who they are, but that's not true. These are the circumstances that they're placed in, which is what leads to these actions. But the sad thing is, like, it just goes to kind of like perpetuate the stereotype even more, which is just like an unbreakable cycle, obviously, which is incredibly difficult to break.
Yeah, it's the same thing with like trans people. Like, people are horribly mean to trans people and just totally exclude them from society, and then they're like, oh, look it, trans people kill themselves because they're crazy. It's like, no, they kill themselves because you're awful to them. Like, it's a cycle. Like, people are just crazy.
I know. And then another thing that we want to mention too is that there is a huge problem when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women. There have been thousands of Native American women who've gone missing or been found dead in recent years in both the US and Canada. But oftentimes, you know, their cases don't get a lot of media attention because either A, they're like people of color, or people assume that, I don't know, you know, like, it's kind of their own problems, like, they just go off and disappear like that, like, and so they don't get proper police investigation, which is a shame, because, like we said, like, they make up so much of the numbers when they make up so very little of the population, which there's obviously, like, that huge discrepancy, and that's obviously something that we need to fix.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like, if serial killers or whoever's, like, abducting them catches on to that, then of course they're going to be like, oh, well, I'll just abduct her because it's,
well, they are easier targets.
Yeah, exactly. Like, nobody's going to look into it. Nobody's going to care.
Absolutely.
And that's just so unfortunate that, you know, when it's a white girl that goes missing, like, time and time again, we've seen when a white girl goes missing, she gets so much more media attention than if a person of color goes missing, even if it's a person of the same age, you know, same circumstance, they'll get way more attention. And it's just disgusting. It really is. Okay, so next we wanted to go into kind of the difference between appreciating a culture and appropriating a culture, because I think that's a big issue in regards to Native Americans. Is not with them, like, with Americans, is appropriating their culture. And I think that, like, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, wearing, like, the headdresses, which, like, I feel like that's less of a thing now, because I know that used to be a thing that, like, white girls would, like, wear that to Coachella, you know what I mean?
I remember seeing pictures of that and just being like, that is in such poor taste.
Yeah, it's like, what did you think? Like, what were you thinking? They just weren't thinking, probably.
Right.
But I think that's, like, less common now, but there's still so many areas of our society that, you know, appropriate their culture. And the reason that it's an issue, because I know a lot of people will be like they don't believe appropriation is a thing, cultural appropriation. But the reason it's an issue is that it's a privilege for a white person to wear a headdress and not get reprimanded from that, or or not be like targeted by that. You know what I mean? Like people might be like, that's wrong what you're doing.
Right.
But on the flip side, for a person of color or for a native person who like actually comes from a tribe that would wear those kind of things, they're stigmatized and they're cast out from society and like not really accepted because of their culture. So
right, like because it makes them different, and yet
exactly
it's harmful because obviously as a white person you're taking this and you're obviously not going to be treated the same way that they would be treated while wearing that. So I think that's the issue, and that no one is really recognizing. You know, they're like, I'm trying to appreciate their culture, and I understand that. Like I also feel sometimes like I am on the line between like what would be appropriate for me to do, like because if I want to, you know, be part of their culture and kind of experience it for myself, like, but I still want to do it in a way that is respectful towards them, obviously, and not damage them in any way. So I mean, I guess that's just something you have to kind of like really think about and just use your common sense. Be like, could this be offensive to anyone in any way? Could this harm anyone in any way? You know, that's just something that you have to think about.
Just think first. Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing I wanted to focus on was how we can support Native Americans today and like, you know, remember their legacy and history. So like both the actual like tribes today and like the reservations, but also like remembering their history instead of erasing it.
Right.
And I think the most important thing would be including Native history in our textbooks, because you know, like they are American history. They are literally like pre-America. You know what I mean? Like when we got here, I feel like like you said, it's very brief what's mentioned in our textbooks, and like when the settlers got here, I feel like that's where history starts in terms of America. It's like, well, settlers got here and then the rest is history. But there's so much more that we're missing, and that's I fear that some of it we'll never even be able to uncover, because kind of what we said earlier, that they've been erased and that literally they've been killed. They've been just like killed off, many of them. There's been like genocides that have happened.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of the people that would be able to tell us those stories are gone now.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, like so there are still people around to tell, and like that they've, you know, kept records and everything, but it's just really disappointing that we haven't kept a better like we haven't kept like the history on that, you know what I mean? And yeah, I feel like that we need to, like, along with including their history, I would like there to be a more accurate portrayal of the settlers and Native Americans in history books, because it wasn't like I saw this thing the other day that like it was from a textbook, and it said like, oh, the settlers got here and the Native Americans were already here, and the Native Americans just kind of moved aside and like let them move in, and so they all got along together.
Which is like, not what happened at all. It's not at all. It's not like, that's not even close.
Yeah, that's literally just not true.
Like that's a straight up
propaganda.
Lie.
Yeah, that's literally not true. And in reality, they stole their land, they stole their resources, they gave them disease, they raped their women, and they killed them. Like, that's what happened. And of course there's exceptions, but it's like sometimes they lived in peace. Like, that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving. But it's just so one-sided what's taught to kids, and I can't stress enough how important your early education is, because it literally forms how you think about the world going on. And so we need to stop lying. We're literally lying to our kids.
Right. And I mean, I understand, like, I feel like the argument for most people would be the fact that they are so young, so they don't really need to be told about this history because it's so violent. But I feel like there are definitely like a compromise between the two. You don't have to go one way completely. You don't also have to go the other way, you know, like teach them about what actually happened. Maybe just don't go into like the gruesome details, but you can tell them, like, you know, when they came here they did steal the land, which was wrong, obviously. Like, I think we should be teaching them that was wrong. And also like the whole Columbus thing, you know, like he's regarded as a hero, and I think it wasn't until I was about to graduate high school that I learned, like, what a horrible person he was and all the shit that he actually did. I was like, this guy is so messed up. Like, yes, he did great things, but he also did terrible things, and I don't think that he should be celebrated for that, because it's like, it's almost as if the terrible things he did were kind of just covered up. Like, oh, we're just gonna ignore this in favor of the fact that he, quote, discovered America, which he didn't, but
yeah, exactly.
that's another thing entirely.
It was already here. People discovered it a long time ago.
So, and again, I feel like most people don't realize that until way later on in life in their formal education, or even maybe not even their formal education. So I feel like that's something we need to fix. I don't think that we should necessarily erase them from history, because that is like a whole nother like slippery slope. And I know that that's what a lot of people are arguing against with the whole removal of statues now. And that's a whole like debate. Sensitive subject. Yeah, I'm not gonna get into it, but I will just say that I feel like there's definitely a middle ground. I don't think we have to say like, oh, we should like lift them up and celebrate them as, you know, like heroes of history, but I also don't think that we should just erase them completely, because they obviously played a huge part, but I think we need to be realistic about who they were and what they did.
Yeah, I think that just goes back to the fact that, like, nowadays there's a lot of dichotomous thinking going on that, like, either you're good or you're bad. Like, literally everyone is either good or bad, and that's it.
Which is not how it works at all.
We can't be like that. Yeah, that's just not going to work. Because, like I said earlier, of course, Native Americans were living in harmony for the most part, but they had wars within themselves. They fought. And, yes, the settlers came in and they basically ruined everything, but sometimes they had peaceful times, you know? So it's like nothing is black and white. Oh, like, overwhelmingly colonization is bad. I think we can say that. But nothing is black and white. And so I think that that's definitely a trend, a concerning trend I've been seeing recently with statues or with our history in general. Nothing's black and white, and we need to like just tell the full picture from like an objective. Like, honestly, maybe people from another country could do a better job of making our history books because they don't have a hand in the pot, you know what I mean? Just say,
like they have no stake in this.
Yeah, like, this is what happened. Maybe that would help, because I don't think Americans can do that at this point. We're too polarized. But moving on to, like, we're kind of going back to the appropriation. So I wanted to talk about this issue of like team names and mascots involving Native Americans. So there's the Redskins. I think natives have been used for some team or something.
I think they're changing the Redskins. Those aren't they?
They either changed it already or they are going to change it. I don't think it's still Redskins.
Right.
And then Indians have been used as, like, there's just many things that, like, just not just team names, but like just in general that have kind of like used these words as like kind of a mascot. And I think at best this is appropriation, and at worst it's dehumanizing, because you're making them a mascot and you're making them just like
a character. Yeah,
a character. And of course, like, I know there's something to be said about like there's other human mascots, like USC, if you know that school. You probably know that school. I don't know how to say it like that. USC, University of Southern California. They're the Trojans, so that's like the, you know, Greek or is Trojan Greek?
I mean, the Trojan horse, but I don't actually know USC's
mascot. Something like that. Yeah, I don't know. But so that's like a historical like type of like figure, and it's a man. It's a human. And then there's like the Cowboys, the NFL team. Obviously, Cowboys are also humans. But I think the difference is that Trojans and Cowboys are not exactly marginalized groups. Like, I think that Trojans, Cowboys, and Native Americans are all seen as like warriors, so like I guess they're all in the same genre in that way. But Trojans and Cowboys are not like marginalized.
No,
Trojans don't exist anymore, but like Cowboys, I wouldn't say are like a marginalized group for the most part. But obviously Native Americans are. To just use them as like that one side of them, that like they're warriors, I feel like that also plays into the idea that they're savages and that they're violent, and they're just so not. You know, like, of course they would fight when they needed to, or when they needed to protect something, but it just, I really feel like it serves to just perpetuate stereotypes and really dehumanize them. And I feel like every step we take, like using their name as like as a mascot or something like that, it's a step away from seeing them as equals, you know. And that's who Native Americans are. They're equal, and everybody should, you know, they should be treated as such. And it's just like, I don't know, I just feel like it would be like, I just feel like it's in poor taste. Like, I feel like if there was a team that was like the Muslims, I would be like, what the hell, man? Like, that's so not cool, you know what I mean? So like, it's just not cute. Let's just not do that going forward. And like you said, I don't think they're the Redskins anymore. I don't know what they're changed to. I
don't know either, but I do know that they have made the move to fix it. I mean, it's been years, but at least, you know, something's finally been, you know, getting done. So at least I feel like that's something we talked about. Like, more and more people are becoming aware of issues like this, which is good.
Yeah, and because you can't, like, necessarily blame them for, like, I don't know, maybe that team was made in, like, the 80s or something. Like,
that's
it was
true,
a
like, very different
like,
times.
Probably nobody, well, probably Native Americans still objected to it back then, but, like, for the most part, people probably weren't seeing that as an issue. And, like, you know, times change. I understand that, but it's just annoying to see people who want that, like, the times to stay the same. Like, the fans were so
there was a lot of backlash
that. Like, they were really mad. I remember watching videos of people with their headdresses on and everything, and they're like, what, we're just, like, appreciating the culture. And it's like, okay, what do you do for Native Americans to support the reservations? Like, you don't appreciate the culture, you just appreciate the team. It doesn't matter what it's called,
right? Like, it has nothing to do with Native Americans. Like, you're just using their face.
Exactly. So yeah, I think that that's just something we should keep in mind going forward. And I think another thing I wanted to mention was we kind of touched on this earlier, like the idea of, like, what do we call Native Americans, and just in general, like, being an ally to different groups. Like, I think something that's really important to bear in mind is using the proper verbiage and using the proper names for them. Like, I think this is also relevant for people who use different pronouns. Just, like, asking them. I don't know why it's so hard for people to just call people what they want to be called. You know what I mean? Like, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. So it's like, whatever somebody prefers to be called, I think just call them that. Just like with African American or Black, some people prefer one or the other. And it's like, whatever they prefer, just use that, you know? And something that came to my mind, though, and I mentioned this earlier, is, like, do Native Americans, I just wonder genuinely, do they even want to be called Native Americans? Because it's like, they were here before it was America, so it's like, it's kind of weird to even call them the Native Americans, because they were before that. It's almost like,
like, they were on this land before it was called America. So obviously, like, that's the thing. Like, I don't know what they're called, or if it's like, do they prefer to be called, like, American Indians, like Native Americans, stuff like that. That's very true. Is that I feel like so often we hear these words from, like, a white person rather than an actual Indigenous person. So that's something that I feel like we have to take into consider, is that what do they want to be referred to?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really what it comes down to, is, like, what do they feel comfortable with? Because maybe there are people who want to be called American Indians because that's just what they've always been called, and, like, it's not for me. Like, even though I'm like, well, it's not India, if that's what they want to be called, like,
that's not up for us to decide.
Yeah, exactly. Because I know that, like, I have things I'm, like, comfortable with being called, like, you know, American or whatever, and I wouldn't want somebody to just, like, impose a title on me, you know what I mean? So I think it's really important to ask and to just be, like, respectful of what other people want to be called. Like, even though we can sit here and say, like, I don't get that, or, you know, why would you want to be called Indian, or whatever it might be, just comes down to, like, whatever they're comfortable with. I think that's what we should go with.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so we also want to touch on Indigenous Australians, like we kind of mentioned before. And so Indigenous Australians were actually descended from people who lived in Australia before European colonization. So very similar to, you know, obviously, like, the Native Americans. And we just kind of wanted to talk about, like, some myths and stereotypes that are still kind of perpetuated today. And some people assume that the Indigenous people look and act like a certain way, and, like, that includes having, like, dark skin, or living in remote areas, or being violent or uncivilized. And again, that's untrue, because while some of them may have darker skin, that doesn't necessarily mean, like, those with lighter skin are not considered, you know, Aboriginals, obviously.
Exactly.
Right. And then they also have these horribly offensive black dolls with exaggerated stereotypical black features, which mocks the Aboriginals, and people are, like, so defensive of them, I guess. Like, what are they called? Is there, like, a specific name for them? I forgot what they're called.
I saw this, like, documentary about it once. I was so disgusted by it, because it was not that long ago. It was a few years ago, the documentary. And, yeah, there's, like, the people that they were interviewing were this couple, like, boomers. But there was a couple that had, like, a whole collection of these dolls. I forget
Is it,
the
like,
name.
the shrunken head dolls, kind of?
No, they're, like, dolls, like, normal dolls, but they're, like, their skin is, like, black, like, the mic, like, black, and then they have, like, of course, like, exaggerated features, just making fun of, like, black people, basically. And, I forgot, I think the name is pretty offensive, too. I don't remember what the name is. But, yeah, they just see nothing wrong with it, you know? Like, a lot of people just think...
They don't see anything wrong with it.
Like, they just think it's fine, and they're like, oh, it's just something we've always had, and it's just, like...
Well, just because you've always had it doesn't mean that you should always have it.
Yeah, it just comes back to, like, dehumanizing them, and it's harmful, and I hope that, you know, so that just kind of shows that this is not just, like, an American thing.
This is something that's happened all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. I hope we can, like, move away from that going forward, because it's like, you don't need to have that thing, dude.
No,
like, I know you might have grown up with it, and I know it's hard to just, like, let go of things. Like, if someone, like, if in the future somehow SpongeBob is offensive and someone's like, you have to, like, well, I don't watch SpongeBob anymore, but you have to, like, renounce SpongeBob, you know, something I grew up with, I would be like, damn, like, that sucks, but, like, you have to, like, hear people out, you know what I mean? And I feel like a lot of people they just hear someone saying that, and they're automatically like, no, like, I grew up with this, and, like, it's okay, and it's fine, and, like, I have black friends, or whatever their excuses.
Right, that's always the defense, right?
Yeah, and it's like, okay, but you need to grow with the times. Don't become, like, you know,
don't get stuck in time.
Stuck in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been, like, so many instances of stuff like this where, you know, obviously just people don't really think about what their actions are doing, and yes, it's hard to change, like, absolutely, it's never easy, but I feel like that's just the part of growing and living life, is that we should learn better as we continue to grow, and we should try to change for the better. That's why I'm always, like, so frustrated when people say, like, oh, well, it's always been like this, or we've been doing this for so long. Like, just because you have been doing it doesn't mean you should keep doing it, or that's what's right, obviously.
Exactly. Like, things change. Like, yeah, people used to do bloodletting because they thought that's how you fix illness, but then we realized
shouldn't do that now.
That kills you. Yeah, exactly. So that whole, like, appeal to antiquity is just, I don't want to hear it. You know what I mean? When people say, oh, well, this is how it's always been. Well, now it's not. Okay,
right. Like, that's just a bullshit argument.
Yeah.
So now we kind of just want to end this on a note of, you know, what can we do to support the Indigenous community? Because obviously that's what's the most important thing here. And obviously the first thing is, like we mentioned before, is just listen to what they have to say. Like we said, like, most of the time we hear stories from the side of white people or people in power, and so very often do we actually get to hear them speak, like, their voice and what they want to say, and I feel like that's incredibly important for us, you know, as allies. And we also should include them in land discussions and make sure their rights are protected, like we mentioned. Like, obviously they have been getting land stolen from them. That's unfortunately not a new thing. And I feel like, yeah, like, building, obviously that's an important part of, you know, like, society and stuff like that, but again, like, they should definitely be part of that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And before we go, I did want to include a resource that I found, because I'm really have been trying to look into more resources for, like, learning about Indigenous cultures and, like, what I can do to support them. And I found this, and I just thought it was really helpful, so I wanted to mention it. It's called the Indigenous Allied Toolkit. It's a short PDF. It's not like it's free. It's not like a book or anything. But it just has a bunch of things to consider and to do, like, to take action when you're, you know, trying to be an ally to Indigenous people. And so we'll link it below. It'll be the first, well, if you're on YouTube, link it below.
Right.
So it'll be the first link provided on our website and our our sources, and it'll be in the caption wherever you listen. So definitely give that a look, because, like I said, it's not long. It's just, like, a few pages, but it has some really important things to consider, and it's just, like where to get started.
Right. So that's another important thing, is to educate yourself and help build awareness, obviously, because, like we said, Indigenous people don't have a voice, so I feel like it's up to everyone to kind of help them be heard.
Yeah, to bolster up their voices.
Yeah. But so that is the end of this episode. We hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll be back next Monday with a brand new episode. And to make sure you guys don't miss out on anything, make sure to follow us on Instagram at darkmatterpod, and our Twitter is at darkmatter_pod. And also, as always, we'll have our sources on our website, darkmatterpod.com, or in the description if you're watching YouTube.
And if you're listening on Spotify, be sure to follow us. Or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, we'd really appreciate if you left us a review. Also, be sure to subscribe and like our videos on YouTube if you enjoyed watching. And be sure to tell your friends to give our podcast a listen if they're looking for something to do. We'd really appreciate it. And thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next week.
Bye.